Five, four, three, two, one.
Welcome to KC Cares, Kansas City's nonprofit voice. We're telling the stories of Kansas City nonprofits and the people behind them. KC Cares is the intersection of the nonprofit and the profit communities, making Kansas City a better place to live, work, and play. KC Cares is proudly sponsored by the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation. I'm Ruth Baum-Biggis. The discussion about education has never been noisier than this past year during the pandemic. Should kids be in school, learning virtually, or taking a break? Meeting students' individual needs are challenging at best. Well, there's one organization that has been centered around individual learning and choice, and that's EdChoice. And joining us today is Mike McShane, who is the Director of National Research for EdChoice, a nonprofit. And I'm so glad, Mike, to finally get the chance to talk with you and dive in about EdChoice.
For sure. It's great to be with you.
And in our introduction, we said Kansas City nonprofits. We do reach out beyond just nonprofits based here, which is EdChoice. You're a national nonprofit. For our audience, can you describe to us what EdChoice is? What are you all about?
Sure. So we are a nonprofit, as you said, that is both a kind of research and advocacy organization around the idea of parental choice in education. For many years, and we're actually celebrating our 25th year this year, we were known as the Milton and Rose Friedman Foundation. And if that name rings a bell to anyone, Dr. Milton Friedman was a Nobel Prize winning economist. For those big public television fans, in the 80s, he had the Free to Choose series. I think in the 90s, he did a bunch of stuff with Phil Donahue. He was on the Donahue show all the time. That's why how many people don't necessarily know his monetary history of America from the Civil War to the Depression. Not as popular as the Phil Donahue show. I would argue probably shouldn't be. But anyway, so we were the legacy foundation of those two brilliant economists. Dr. Friedman wrote a piece in the 1950s about how the American education system could benefit from more choice. And so we've been involved in doing that for 25 years. So we have a kind of research arm, which I'm in, where we try to better understand the American education system and try and understand the way that choice plays or doesn't play a role in that system. And then we also have an advocacy arm where we work mostly with local coalitions, local partners to advance school choice proposals in their states and communities.
So school choice has been around. It's not a new topic, but certainly an area that continues developing and of interest. Can you share with us kind of what maybe the current scene is like? And there's even been some stuff going on in Kansas that we can talk about.
Kansas and Missouri this legislative session. So yes, so the thing is, school choice is the norm in the American education system. People choose frequently where they live or where their kids go to school frequently. Now, the issue is it is the norm for people with money. So people who are able to live within the geographic zone of the school where they would like to send their children have school choice. And 'twas ever thus. As long as we've had education in America, people of means have had choice. The problem is, here in Kansas City and across the country, people without means, people who aren't able to necessarily buy that house in the better zoned school district, or they don't have the money to send their kids to private schools or to homeschool their children, they have been kind of locked out of this. And unfortunately, they've had to kind of take whatever their local school board or their local school district gives them. So school choice is not a new topic at all. The question has always been, how do we expand school choice to the broadest number of people? And there have been different policy interventions over time. The real thing that we at EdChoice are interested in, that while we support all sorts of different things, so maybe folks might be familiar with everything going back from magnet schools, charter schools, inter-district choice or open enrollment, where students are able to go outside of their assigned public school. But a lot of the work that we've done is around what we would call private school choice, which allows funding to follow children to the school of their choice, even if that school is private. So the term that people are probably most familiar with is school vouchers. And while school vouchers have actually been around for a really long time, the kind of modern school voucher movement started in the early 1990s. There was a program in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and another in Cleveland, Ohio. And slowly but surely, over the course of the last couple of decades, that has grown and grown from those 2 programs to now more than 70 programs in probably around 30 states around the country that in various different ways or for various populations of students allow them to attend private school with some kind of support from the state. So it's obviously a very contentious topic. It has been a contentious topic since, again, as I said, it's been around for a very long time, but when sort of policy started happening in the 90s, it's been contentions since then. Those that are fans of The West Wing might remember there's a whole episode around school vouchers where the mayor of Washington, D.C. is arguing with the president, and then his special assistant, Charlie, comes in and sort of makes actually one of the best cases for school vouchers I've ever heard. So that may be some people's introduction to that idea. So yeah, so it's definitely well, the concept makes sense to a lot of people. When you actually kind of operationalize it, it can be quite controversial.
This may be a really basic question, but I want to throw it out there. Why education choice? Why should you have it? We have schools, they offer basic stuff. Why is this important?
I mean, that's sort of a question you could extend to anything. Well, why choose anything? Why choose your car? Why choose your house? Why not have somebody else choose it for you? So I think one of the big things that we've known, and I should say, I started my career as a high school teacher, as a 9th and 10th grade teacher. And one of the things that you notice with kids is that different kids thrive in different environments. I think actually, the whole debate that we've had about education over the past few decades, we've had a real, I think in some ways, an unproductive one where we talk about good schools and bad schools. And oftentimes, the good schools are the ones with the high test scores. The good schools are the ones where wealthier kids go, which on the ground, when you actually spend time in schools, isn't always the case. I tend to think much more, rather than saying these are good schools and these are bad schools, I think of just the concept of fit. Different kids will fit into different environments. And so what might be, some people would say, oh my goodness, this is like the best school in Kansas City. Well, it might not be the best school for every kid. There may be individual students that don't thrive in that environment. And so given that different students thrive in different environments, we want to maximize the choices that they have available to them. So whether that's different pedagogical strategies, whether that's different sort of philosophies behind the school, whether that's different sort of organizational models. Maybe some schools like technology more and others like technology less, and some have more structure and some have less structure. There's no one kind of right answer. There's no one best way to educate kids. So allowing for that kind of diversity of options and allowing for families to find the one that best fits the needs of their children, I think is good for kids, but it's good for the schools as well, right? Anybody who's taught knows if you have a child in your classroom or in your school that doesn't sort of fit in with the school philosophy or doesn't get along well with their other students, they make everybody else miserable, right? So it's best for that child to find the environment that's best for them, and it's best for all the other kids and for the teacher that the students that they have in their classroom are the ones that are thriving there. So I get why, there's lots of historical reasons why we organize schools the way that we do. And I think at different times in American history, it made more sense. But in the year of our Lord 2021, where we have such a panoply of choices across so many other aspects of our life, the fact that we would say for a child's K-12 education, it's like, nope, you have this one school, and unless you want to pay to go somewhere else, you don't have that other option, just really seems that is the aberration in when the norm is a world full of choice.
How on top of this is the average parent? That's a hard definition, but to know that there really are options and that there are options beyond, quote unquote, the rich person.
Yeah, I mean, so sure. So part of our work, we do a lot of stuff around parent organizing. So we work both on the advocacy side for parents who advocate for educational choice, but we also work with parents to understand this sort of exact question, the options that are available to them. Because in many cases, even when these programs exist, letting people know that those options are available to them takes time and energy and outreach effort. So that's a lot of the work that we do, because there are many times that, a state will pass a law, or there'll be, a program that's made available, and you talk to folks, they say, oh my goodness, I had no idea that was even there. So that's a fair bit of the work that we do. I will say, there is a pretty robust research literature about parental choices, about people who make, and in many of the cases, these are parents from incredibly poor backgrounds, low levels of education themselves. And parents are much savvier consumers than I think people give them credit for. We've done some kind of interesting studies where you ask parents ahead of time, what are you looking for in a school? And then they get to choose schools, and then you follow up years later and you ask them, like, what are the main characteristics of your school? And you compare those two lists. Were they able to find a school that matched their characteristics? And overwhelmingly, they are able to do that. Parents are able to go into a school and realize, hey, this school will work well for my child. Hey, this school is academically rigorous. Hey, this school is safe. Parents can pick that up pretty darn quickly. So it's more of just granting the opportunity for families to do that, letting them know that those options are available to them, and then, like getting them to participate in the program.
So how does EdChoice do that? How do you help those parents?
Yeah. So again, we host workshops, we host retreats, we host organizing sessions in various cities, and we also work with local partners. So in many cases, you have local groups of schools that already exist. You have local pastors groups. You have all of those folks that are already active in the community. And what we try to do is provide what we've learned over the course of 25 years in other states. Hey, you have a new program in your state this year. Well, look, you're like the 30th state that's done this. Here's what everybody else did. Here are ways to get folks together. Here are ways to publicize these types of things. So we work with mostly with our local coalition partners, and try and support them rather than trying to do the stuff directly ourselves, because there's nothing worse in educational advocacy, or frankly, in most advocacy spaces, if you parachute into a community and you don't know anyone and you've never been there before, and suddenly you try and get people to trust you or believe in you or any of those things, usually doesn't go well. What's better to do is cultivate relationships with people who have already been on the ground, who've already been advocating for this stuff, and sort of ask them, what do you need? How can we help you? You want this, we want you to have this. How can we work together?
Well, I know you're on the national level, but do you by off chance know who some of those partners are in and around the Kansas City area or Kansas, Missouri?
Sure. I mean, there have been educational advocates here in Kansas City operating for a very long time. And I think a lot of them have been affiliated, in the greater network of like the Kauffman Foundation. They've been working for a very long time with different groups. But you have everybody, I would look at mostly in the Kansas City area, folks that are associated with like the charter school. So there's the Missouri Public Charter School Association. There's a group out of St. Louis called SEAM, the Children's Educational Alliance of Missouri. They do some work in Kansas City as well. They're more of a kind of St. Louis and statewide organization, but they've done work around there. Obviously, you have groups like the Catholic diocese that are here that work in that space as well. So there's been different groups over time, but I think SEAM is probably one of the biggest ones that we work with in Missouri, Children's Educational Alliance for Missouri.
How do you deal with the concern that gets raised of taxpayers saying, I pay for public education. This is, taking away money from those public schools. We're just going to drive those into the ground, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a sort of philosophical answer to that question, and there's like a empirical answer to that question. So the philosophical answer to that question, I say, look, when we say public education, or when we say public schools, public education is an idea. It's the idea that we have an obligation to our children to instruct them in the things that they need to know and be able to do to be successful in life and to participate in our democracy, in our economy, and in our society. I think in many places we have conflated one particular delivery method with that idea. But we don't have to do that, right? So we've conflated residentially assigned, public school districts with the idea of public education. And we don't have to do that, right? We can say, listen, there are lots of different institutions that can provide that public education that prepares children to succeed in our democracy, society, and economy. And what's funny is across almost every other issue area, right, we have these kind of mix of public and private providers. So you can take your Medicaid dollars to St. Luke's, or you can go to, you can go to Catholic hospitals, you can go to Lutheran hospitals, it doesn't matter. You can take your Pell Grant to a private college. You can take the GI Bill to a private college. There's preschool funding that goes. So it's so weird that people seem to be okay with it for preschool and for college. But for this one weird part of children's education, suddenly it's like, no, this one group of institutions is sacrosanct and the others aren't. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Now, look, there's also an empirical question here, which is to say, like, do these programs actually, quote unquote, take money from public schools? And almost always that relies on some kind of tricky accounting, because you have to remember that when a student leaves to take a school voucher somewhere else, that's also one fewer student that public school has to educate. So provided that the amount of the voucher is less than that marginal cost of the student leaving, and sure, look, they have to keep the lights on and they have to pay janitorial staff and others. So even netting that out, in almost every case, the amount of money that students leave with vouchers is less than that marginal cost. And so schools actually come out ahead on a per pupil basis. Now, the overall amount might be less, but you have to take into account that they have fewer students. And so like the program in Missouri or programs across the country are only talking about the state contribution to education. So schools are funded by a mix of local property tax dollars, state dollars, which is generally income and sales tax, and federal dollars. Vouchers almost never touch those local dollars or those federal dollars. Those will continue. Your property taxes go to your school district regardless of the number of kids that are in it, right? You get the property tax bill, it goes to your local school district. If there's 10 kids or 10,000 kids, that's how many go there. And federal funds have all sorts of sort of peculiarities to them that the money never goes down. So even if you have fewer kids, you don't really lose your federal funds. The only thing we're talking about is about the 40% that comes from the state. So again, there's a philosophical answer that even if that money wasn't going, I think it should follow the kid to the school that actually educates them. But if we want to talk, like actually get down to brass tacks and talk about the dollars and cents, the argument falls apart there too. I think you're muted.
I was muted.
Yeah, there you go.
Mike McShane, who's with EdChoice, a national organization that is providing the resources and the information to parents to have educational choice. I know we've had some action right in the Kansas side fairly recently about a tax credit for low-income student scholarship program. Are you familiar where you can maybe share a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. So this program already existed and it was expanded during this particular legislative session, or I guess the eligibility was expanded. So the way the program in Kansas works is Kansas citizens can get a tax credit if they donate money to a scholarship granting organization. So the way that it would work is these are nonprofit scholarship organizations that grant scholarships to low-income kids. If you make a donation to that, the amount of money that you donate up to some limits is credited against your tax liability, right? So this isn't actually like a school voucher. It's not a direct expenditure from the state. It's a tax credit, like there are so many other tax credits that exist in the state. Again, fascinating how controversial this can be, but all the other ones seem to be okay. But anyway, I digress. But yeah, so that's the way that it works. And previously, prior to this legislative session, it had some of the most strict eligibility rules of any tax credit scholarship program in the country. It was limited to students who attended, I think, the 100 lowest performing schools in the state, and students who qualified for not just free and reduced lunch, but just the free part of lunch. So you had to both be incredibly poor and attend one of the lowest performing schools. Well, the problem is there's all sorts of reasons why the lowest 100 performing schools change every year, and the metrics that they use, they change the metrics as well. So it was not a good way to determine that. So this legislative session, they got rid of that. You don't have to be from one of the 100 lowest performing schools. And I believe they upped the eligibility, not just a free, but free or reduced price lunch. So it moved from incredibly poor people to just very poor people are able to participate in it. Now, again, the program, I think, still kept its cap. I want to say it's either $5 or $10 million in tax credits that are made available. So again, if you look at that in the scope of everything that Kansas spends on education, which is in the billions of dollars, a $10 million program, we're talking a couple thousand kids are going to participate in it, and it's a rounding error in the state budget, particularly when they're about to get a flood of federal dollars from all of the 3 coronavirus acts that came in. So it's still a very small program. It became a little bit less stringent this year. But hopefully more students are going to be able to participate. There's going to be more certainty about who's eligible and who isn't. And families, there were some awful stories where, because the boundary lines for elementary schools and middle schools and high schools can be different, because one family, who again, incredibly poor, but one child was still zoned for the elementary school and one was for the middle school. One child was eligible for the program and the other wasn't, even though they were from the same family. They were like a year apart in siblings. So they got rid of all of that. So I think that was a good change that they made.
Anything that's top of mind on the Missouri side? So
Missouri is actually a really interesting case. So what they've done is created a tax credit funded education savings account. So on the Kansas side, a tax credit funded scholarship, those scholarship granting organizations basically grant the way what we would normally think of as a scholarship, which you can take to one school to pay for your education. What they created in Missouri was that those scholarship granting organizations are actually going to manage education savings accounts. And so rather than taking that money to one provider, it'll be put in a flexible use spending account. So think of it, for some people that maybe from your health insurance, you have an HSA. So money goes into that account. And if you go to CVS, right, you can buy Tylenol with it, but you can't buy beer. Like, that's basically how it works. So it's an education savings account, works the same way, which you would get a debit card that the state would say, here are the types of things that you can spend it on. And you'd have more flexibility. So maybe some of the money you want to go to private school tuition, but other parts you want to go to tutoring, or you want to go to services if your child has special needs and they need therapies or anything like that. This is a newer type of program. So vouchers have been around since the early 1990s. I think the first tax credit scholarships showed up in kind of the late 1990s, early aughts. And the first education savings account program showed up about 10 years ago in Arizona. So this is a newer form of educational choice. But I think particularly as a result of the pandemic, where so many families were scrambling and were putting together different providers, like, oh, hey, we want to use this online math, tutoring stuff for our child, and we're going to use, go to a tutor over here for something else, or we're going to learn a foreign language via Rosetta Stone or something like that. A lot of people across the country have thought, hey, that would be awesome. It would actually be really cool if that funding was much more flexible and we didn't have to just choose one provider who may be doing well, maybe doing poorly, maybe a good fit, maybe a bad fit, but we could actually spread that out between multiple different folks.
Well, you mentioned the P word, so we got to go there. For your organization, what has the pandemic year been like? And are there takeaways that are positive that you'll keep?
So I would say on two sides of it, of like the work that we actually do from our polling. So part of what we do is public opinion polling. We've done a national poll since 2013, and starting last March, we instituted a monthly poll. We partner with Morning Consult, which is like a polling firm, and we poll a nationally representative sample of Americans every month and a nationally representative sample of teachers every quarter. But I can tell you from our polling across all of the kind of types of school choice that we follow, education savings accounts, school vouchers, tax credit scholarships, and charter schools, in December of last year, all of them were the most popular they have ever been at any point that we have polled them in close to a decade now. Homeschooling, again, was another one where polling shot up, 20 and 30 points in favorability towards homeschooling. All of those things are much more popular. So this legislative session, which most places across the country runs from January to May, saw more bills debated and more passed and more other year in American history. So for that side of it, of the actual work that we do, we've never seen a kind of landslide like we saw this year. And as someone who I testified in some of these hearings or I witnessed them, so much of it was related to the pandemic, which was parents realizing that they need options. Because for so many parents, whatever their local school district did, some that were in person, but they weren't comfortable in person, some were remote and they didn't want them to be remote, some went hybrid and they didn't want to do that. So many parents and legislators and advocates said, look, we have to have more options. Now, from the operational side of our offices, so I think, as you mentioned, we're headquartered in Indianapolis, Indiana. I work remotely here from Kansas City, and we have some folks remotely kind of scattered across the country. And, I think we have been, because we do so much outreach, I can't even think of how many, we probably do 50 or 60 events a year. All of that had to go online, which was a big change. We just restarted doing in-person stuff within the last couple of weeks. And so, yeah, that was a big adjustment. I think at the beginning, there were lots of questions of, how long is this going to last? Should we try and push it? So last spring, it was like, well, should we try and push stuff to the fall? And then it became like, oh man, I don't think the fall is going to work either. And then even this spring, should we push back to this fall? I don't know if you're like me, but basically this fall, like every conference on earth is if you want to, in education world, if you want to go to a conference, you go to like 2 a week from September to December. So then trying to kind of get into the queue of hotels and all the folks that are doing that. But we basically went remote. I think they reopened our offices probably around Thanksgiving for people who wanted to go in. But people weren't sort of required to. And we're still remote now. I know there's conversations about getting back to the office, but I can say, I think for many ways, the types of, we set up lots of tools to collaborate using Microsoft Teams and using sort of regular meetings. And I think for lots of ways, like, there are lots of coworkers, because I was already remote. I talk to way more now than I did before, because we've set up these kind of structures to have these meetings and work with one another, because we were so spread out. So I think for lots of projects that we did, actually working remotely on them was great. It ended up being good. And as someone who's worked remotely for a long time, so I do a lot of writing, I do a lot of research. Offices are bad for me. Right. I'm naturally kind of gregarious, kind of outgoing person. And I need to focus. I need to kind of sequester myself and write for 3 or 4 hours at a time. So working from home is great for me, work-wise. Maybe it isn't as good socially, but so I think a fair number of my coworkers experience the same thing. Graphic designers and other researchers, and all of those folks were able to, people who work in accounting and HR and all this, they were able to really focus on their work and get a lot done in often less time.
So EdChoice dealt with choice.
Exactly. We gave our folks choice. And look, and we had, so many of my coworkers had school age kids or kids that were in daycare. And so stuff was up in the air all the time. We don't know. We're hearing from our district next week, we're going to be back in person. Oh no, well, we're actually only going to be in part-time. And so I think our office, as a place that's so family focused and family centered, I think they really rolled with the punches and said, look, we know everything's up in the air. We know we will be flexible. Come in, don't come in, work remotely, work a different schedule if you have to, because we know everyone's lives have been, there's so much upheaval. Yeah, for sure.
Well, the organization is EdChoice. The website is edchoice.org. I would encourage our audience to go to the website. It is robust in all kinds of information and resources. We didn't even get into the whole thing of the 1, 2, 3s of school choice. That's a great presentation. So I encourage folks. Mike, thank you so much. And we want to thank you for listening to KC Cares, Kansas City's nonprofit voice. We're produced by Charitable Communications, and we're proudly sponsored by the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation. If you'd like to be a guest on KC Cares or underwriting opportunities, visit our website at www.kccaresonline.org and spread the love. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at KC Cares Radio and on Instagram at KC Cares Online. And catch us on Saturday mornings at 8 a.m. on ESPN 1510 AM, 94.5 FM. Thank you for joining us on KC Cares.